I used to think the worst pain a man could feel was the breaking of his bones, the tearing of his skin, the sharp edge of steel cutting through flesh. But I was wrong. The deepest pain is betrayal, and not just by anyone, but by your own blood. My son Daniel was the pride of my life. I raised him on sweat, sacrifice, and soil. Every blister on my hands built the foundation under his feet. I taught him how to fight, how to hunt, how to work the land. I gave him everything I had, everything I was. But somewhere along the way, he decided it wasn't enough. It started with small things, arguments that didn't end, silences that stretched too long, his eyes looking at me not with love, but with resentment. I brushed it off, told myself it was just a phase. Boys grow restless. They want more. I thought he'd find his way back. But he didn't. One night, I came home to find the locks changed. My own house, the house I built with my 2 hands, shut against me. Daniel stood on the porch, his silhouette sharp against the fading sun. "You don't live here anymore," he said flatly. I laughed, thinking it was some kind of cruel joke. But then I saw the papers. Deeds, contracts, forged signatures, things I never signed but carried my name. He had been planning this for months, maybe years. I said, "You stole from me," voice shaking. He shot back, "I took what you wouldn't give. It's mine now. You had your time." And just like that, he turned his back on me. I should have fought then. Should have dragged him down and beaten sense back into him. But shock paralyzed me. I walked away, thinking maybe he'd realize the weight of what he'd done. But the weight never fell on him. It fell on me. Weeks turned into months. I slept in an old shed on the edge of town, while Daniel lived in my house, sat at my table, wore my clothes, called himself master of everything I had built. Word spread, and people whispered. Some pitied me, some laughed, but all agreed Daniel was ruthless, and I was finished. But they were wrong. Betrayal doesn't kill a man, it reshapes him. It burns away weakness until all that remains is iron. And I became iron. I watched Daniel from the shadows. I learned his routines. He strutted through town, surrounded by men who once worked for me, bribed into his service with stolen money. He built himself a reputation as a man not to be crossed. But every man has a weakness, and I knew his better than anyone. Daniel craved respect, but what he wanted more than anything was fear. He wanted people to bow, to step aside, to tremble when they saw him. But that kind of hunger makes you reckless, and recklessness is what I would use to bring him down. It started simple. Tools went missing. Wagons broke down. Fences collapsed. Nothing too large, nothing too obvious, just enough to gnaw at his pride. His men whispered about bad luck, about someone working against them. Daniel raged, broke things, screamed, but he couldn't prove anything. I left him notes. Short, sharp, carved into wood, slipped under doors. A father never forgets. Blood is not loyalty. I am still here. At first, he dismissed them. But when the accidents grew closer, sharper, when one of my men fell from a broken ladder and nearly cracked his skull, when the barn fire burned half my supplies, he started to look over his shoulder. He started to see shadows where there were none. And that was the beginning of my revenge. I waited until winter, when nights were long and darkness was my ally. Daniel had grown careless in his paranoia, drinking more, barking orders like a king losing his crown. His men were loyal out of fear, not love, and fear fades when danger comes too close. That night, I crept into the house I once called mine. The walls smelled of smoke and whiskey, not the wood and earth I had built it with. Daniel sat in my chair, boots up on my table, glass in hand, firelight painting his face in shades of arrogance. He didn't see me until I was standing in the doorway. "Evening, son," I said softly. His glass froze mid-air. For the first time in years, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. "You should have stayed gone," he muttered, standing too quickly, the chair scraping back. "And miss this moment?" I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. He reached for the pistol on his belt, but I was faster. My crowbar, the same one I used to build this house, cracked across his wrist, sending the gun clattering to the floor. He screamed, rage and shock twisting his face. "You think you can take what's mine and live easy?" I snarled. "You think betrayal goes unpunished?" We fought. Furniture shattered. Glass exploded. Fire roared higher. Daniel was strong, stronger than me, younger, faster, but he was sloppy. Rage makes you blind. I dodged, countered, every blow fueled by years of betrayal and nights of cold. At last, I had him pinned, crowbar at his throat, his eyes wide and furious. "You wanted to be a man?" I said, voice trembling with rage and sorrow. "Then face the consequence of your choices." I pressed harder, watching him choke, watching the panic set in. But I didn't kill him, not yet. Death is mercy, and mercy is not what he deserved. I leaned close, so only he could hear. "This is just the beginning." I left him gasping on the floor of the house he had stolen, knowing his nightmare had only just begun. I left him there, gasping on the floor of the house he'd stolen, the firelight painting his face in ugly, guilty shadows. That sound he made, half cough, half wail, followed me out into the night like a second heartbeat. I slept in the shed again that winter, but sleep was thin and tasted like iron. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, the way he'd raised his hand against me, the way he'd signed my name away like it meant nothing. Revenge is a slow currency. You spend it in small increments. Save it up for the moment that will hurt most. I could have crushed him the night I left him on that floor. I could have finished it cleanly, like a man cutting a bad branch. But killing is easy. Living with the ruin is harder, for them and for you. I wanted him to live long enough to watch everything rot. So I started pulling threads. Daniel ran the place like a drunk satrap trying to rule a collapsing kingdom. He signed deals with men who smelled of fast money and cheaper lies. He sold off acres in exchange for quick cash and loud promises. He replaced loyal hands with mercenaries who took orders from a wallet, not a name. That was his weakness, impatience. He believed speed could hide sin. My first move was practical. I knew the irrigation valve schedule, the weak joints in the barns, the places where rats could chew a wire and bring down a day's work. I started small. A tampered bolt here, a loose connection there. A tractor stalled in the field at dawn, a generator that wouldn't catch when the first cold snap came. People said bad luck. Daniel called for repairmen and cursed the weather. I watched him from the tree line as he cursed and spat and felt the ground shift under him. When the feed silo burst one night, dumping a month's worth of corn into mud, his men panicked. That was the seed of real fear. Food is money on a farm. No grain, no income, no leverage. He screamed at supervisors, slapped a man who tried to calm him, and then paced the yard like a caged animal. His confidence was an act on the outside, and the cavity on the inside. I had trimmed the edges of that cavity until it bled. But I needed more than small disasters. Men like Daniel only understand two languages: humiliation and loss. I arranged both. There was a banker in town who still owed me a favor. A quiet man who remembered when I'd saved his ledger from a fire. He'd never approve loans for men who couldn't show steady books. I paid him in old favors and a promise of labor when the harvest came. And he pulled the loan Daniel had been counting on to cover the winter bills. No funds, no contractors, no options. Daniel's men watched their paychecks shrink and their patience fray. He started to make mistakes, harsh orders, public beratings, threats he couldn't back up. I spread rumors, the kind that eat a man alive. A whisper here about a forged signature, a rumor of a lien filed in a quiet county office, a grainy photocopy of a deed that looked suspicious sent to a local paper. Men in town began to avoid him in the same way they avoid a stray dog that might bite. His swagger turned into a twitch. He'd glance over his shoulder when he entered the bar. Men no longer laughed at his jokes. They lowered their heads and sipped their beers faster. That's when I decided to make him watch his world burn. Not literally at first. I wanted the slow, inexorable kind of collapse. The 5-year mortgage paid on time until the bank calls. The monthly checks that stop. The neighbor who never comes over again with fresh eggs. I called in favors from old hands, a mechanic who'd fixed my trucks for 20 years, a fence builder who still knew how to work in weather and respect. They sabotaged nothing. They fixed everything the right way and quietly reported Daniel's corner cutting. People started whispering, "He isn't as clever as he thinks." That's a dangerous conversation in a town like ours. But talk alone would not finish him. I needed a reckoning that cut him to the bone. One night I walked into his office, the same place where he'd once sat as a boy and learned to count bushels, and I found ledgers, plenty of ledgers, some clean, some dirty. I copied entries with a gloved hand, made lists, found the names of the men he'd used, the check numbers, the dates. I made a map of his deceit.
Then I visited the man who'd once been my partner, old Frank, who had a soft spot for tradition and a granite intolerance for thieves. I placed the papers in his hands and watched the color drain from his face as he read. Frank didn't call the sheriff. He walked to the Main Street diner, ordered black coffee, and let the right people find him. Word travels fast when you put something real in the right hands. Within a week, the county inspector had a copy of Daniel's ledger. The slow leak I'd started became a flood. When the inspector came, Daniel met him at the gate with his bravado still lacquered on. "You can check whatever you like," he had said, as though someone could not follow a trail of forged receipts and empty promises. They checked. They found holes. Contracts with dates that didn't match shipments, weight bills that had been altered, payments that vanished into thin air. The law doesn't care for the reason behind a forged signature. It cares for the ink and the paper. He was charged with fraud, and the town that had once bowed now stared. Men who'd feared him suddenly had a new appetite, revenge that looked like justice. I watched Daniel stand in the county office, face pale as milk, as the inspector read the list. He tried to bargain to the last moment, offered up swear words and tears, called me names loud enough for the clerk to hear. No one moved to help him. Some simply turned away and shook their heads. The mercy he had been denied in his youth, he begged for now, and nobody offered it. But I still hadn't finished. The law can take money, can take titles, can press a man's pride into the dirt. It can't always strip him of the small, private things that matter. Memories, relationships, the sense that your world is right. That's what I went for next. There was a woman, Ellen, who'd once loved him in a way that looked like possibility. She had been a bright spot in his coerced household, a soft reflection, and when the charges hit, I fed her a fact she had not known. The true extent of his deception included her family's name in a way he had hidden. I sent her the paperwork, carefully selected pages, blacked out in places so it read like a revelation rather than a smear. She came to him the night before his arraignment and left with a suitcase and a look that said she'd reclaimed herself.
Losing Ellen was a knife I hadn't been ready for. I staggered through the town after that, a man stripped of the last tapestry of civility he'd kept. The boys I'd hired as guards started to skip shifts. His truck sat idle more nights than not. When the first hearing came, the court was packed. I sat in the back, cold in my coat, the papers in my hands like a rosary. Daniel stood in front of the judge and tried to look like the good son, the decent man. It was a mask that slid and cracked. Witnesses came forward with receipts and stories, men who'd taken his promises and given up sweat and time. He tried to name people who'd sold him out, but the town had its own way of settling old scores. You don't press a blade into the side of a man who fed you a lifetime of favors without expecting later that favors might be returned. Loyalty is transactional. He was fined, and the judge gave him community hours he'd never live long enough to complete, with anger in his bones. On paper, he had been punished. In the field, he'd been stripped. But I wanted him to feel the hollow in the center of his life where love had been. I wanted him to listen for the silence in his house where laughter used to be loud. That night, I walked past his window and saw him sitting in the chair I'd once slept in, head bowed, and the light casting a sickly glow. He was a man worn by his own making. I could have let the law finish him. I could have walked away and let the quiet settle like snow. Instead, I wanted one last lesson. I crept into the kitchen. He slept in the old armchair, the same chair he'd used as a throne. I reflected on the nights we'd spent with my hands on his shoulder, the stories we'd shared, and the slow tilt of his heart when he'd chosen theft over gratitude. I thought of the boy who had carved a toy boat for me out of scrap wood with hands that would later write forged checks. I stood there a long time, cataloging the difference between what had been and what was. Then I picked up an old photograph from the mantel. Me, younger, hair dark, Daniel small on my knee, both of us smiling for a world that hadn't betrayed me. I held it like a relic and felt something heavy set in my chest, the end of a thing I'd loved and the beginning of the consequence that would follow. I did not kill him that night. I left the photo on his chest so that when he woke, he'd see our faces first. The next morning he rose, and the sight of the two of us together, father and son, was the only ember of humanity left in him. For a moment I saw his eyes mist, and I almost went soft. But softness had been what made him cruel. I walked away and let him carry that memory like a coal in his mouth. The final scene came later, when the winter thaw turned to mud and the barn lights flickered longer into the night. Daniel had a small following still, a few men who'd been bought and paid for, some who still hoped for returns. They organized a late-night run to move stock that the bank would seize, a desperate try to salvage what remained. They didn't expect me, or maybe they did and thought me too old to matter. Either way, they were wrong. I shadowed them to the lot where the trucks were loaded. The air smelled of diesel and wet earth, and the men moved fast, cursing the cold. I saw Daniel at the center, barking orders, face pale with a mix of hope and fear. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The only time a man like him would risk his head. Desperation. A scuffle started when an old rival pushed too hard over space. Words flew, hands were raised. Men who'd once followed me like mastiffs now hesitated. That's when I stepped out, not as a ghost, but as a shape in the rain, the metal tool I'd used to build and to punish glinting in my hand. "Enough," I said, and the sound sliced through the din. Daniel turned, and in his eyes I saw everything we'd been. The boy who'd loved me, the man who'd betrayed me, the man who'd brought us both to this field. He lunged, a wild, desperate charge. I met him with the same tool, the arc of the swing practiced from years of muscle memory. We collided like two storms. It was not a clean fight. It was blood and mud and the taste of iron. He bit me, a desperate animal thing, and I felt the shock of his teeth. I swung again, and this time my blow landed true. The world narrowed to the sound of bone and the wet thud of impact. He went down, eyes wide and uncomprehending, a sound like a small animal escaping from a snare. He was dying. The men scattered like leaves in wind. I knelt beside him as the rain turned red around us. There is a brutal intimacy to watching the life leave someone who has been a part of you. His hands searched for mine, like a child reaching for comfort. "Why?" he whispered, a single question that had rolled under so many words and choices. The back door of his theft, the night they changed the locks, all of it reduced to that small breath into the mud. "Because you forgot what it means to be a man," I said, voice breaking on the last word. "Because you traded blood for coin." I wanted to tell him all the things I knew would mean nothing, to list the nights and the bruises and the loyalty he'd crushed, but words are thin against blood. He tried to laugh, then coughed, and went quiet. I watched the light leave his eyes and felt something in my chest crack. Not regret for what I'd done, but a hollowing that felt like a cost you can never pay back. I sat there until the rain washed the worst of the blood away and the last shiver left his body. When the men came back later, I was sitting alone beside a boy who had been my son. There was no celebration in their faces, no relieved smiles. There was only the practicalness of life. We bury, we clean, we move on. They did what had to be done. They covered him with burlap and called the sheriff with hands that trembled. I walked back to the house under a gray sky and picked up the photograph again, the one with our faces smiling and younger. I kept it in my pocket for a long time. It warmed slightly from my body heat, reminding me of a small, old warmth that the world could no longer hold. People will tell you I was a monster. Some will say I deserved it. Some will call me a hero. The truth sits somewhere between. I was a father who had been buried alive by his own child, and I rose. I took back what was mine, and in the taking, I paid a price they don't teach you about in any school of vengeance. Now the fields are quieter. The house sits with fewer sounds. At night, I walk alone and listen for the echo of footsteps that won't come. Sometimes, when the wind cuts across the land, I hold the photograph and think about a boy carving a toy boat, about hands that once fit in mine. The last lesson I taught Daniel was brutal and final. It was the lesson he demanded, with every signature he forged and every lie he told. If you ask me now whether it was worth it, I will not lie. The victory tastes like ash. The farm is back under my name. The men who run it know how to pull a plow, and the accounts are straight. But the space where a sun used to be remains a hollow no harvest can fill. I can feed the workers, mend the fences, and watch the seasons roll. But when the nights are long and the small noises come, I think about what I have done and who I have become. There are no clean endings to these things, only the slow work of getting up in the morning, of making coffee, of fixing a fence, of remembering and trying not to let memory make you crueler than you intend. The last lesson was taught in mud and blood. I learned another lesson that night too, that vengeance takes more than it gives, and sometimes what you win is only the right to wake up and feel the weight of your choices anew.